Alrighty, welcome everybody to the Organizing the Green New Deal free course. This is class number 11, and we have some really exciting guests today. We've got Colette, Pichon-Battle, and Emma Collin from Gulf South for Green New Deal, or from the Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy, and they're going to tell us about the Gulf South for Green New Deal. It's going to be a really exciting class for folks who are following along. Please put your question in the chat, and as soon as our presentation's done, we'll do a little bit of Q&A. Take it away, folks.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Nick. And my gratitude to Breach Collective and to Power Shift, respect to the work y'all are doing. I think this is a really great idea, and we're honored to be a part of it. And bonjour, y'all, to folks out in the ether world who I cannot see, but I know you're there because I can see your participant numbers. So just giving you a greetings from Southeast Louisiana. I am in St. Tammany Parish, which is the traditional lands of the Choctaw Territory, the Choctaw Nation. So just bringing my greetings from there. And would love to ask my colleague Emma to introduce herself, and then I'll tell a little bit about Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy, and we'll get started.
Hey y'all, how's it going? Thank you, Colette, and thank you, Nick, and my gratitude as well to the crew who are organizing this. My name is Emma Collin, I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Director of Programs and National Alignment at the Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy, and I had to help do a lot of coordination for Gulf South for Green New Deal. So I'm really excited to be on this particular call and share a little bit of the work that's moving in the Gulf South.
Awesome. Thanks, Emma. And so Emma and I are going to walk you through a pretty great formation that we have the honor of being a part of here in the Gulf South. Just to give you a little bit of an understanding of who we are, the Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy is a public interest law firm and justice center. We were formed after Hurricane Katrina, and in that aftermath, we worked through legal services in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, the aftermath of the BP oil drilling disaster, and really from there began to connect the dots to disaster recovery and extractive impact of extractive economies and extractive industries. And so really took our journey into the climate movement from the door of disaster recovery. So we're coming in having relationships on the ground that were built in the recovery process and really sort of building this movement from there. It's an important note to start from because we're organizing a little bit different from most folks who are organizing sort of with an idea. We're usually organizing based on impact and experience. So pulling people in that way. We've been around for almost 16 years now and are growing. We're a small shop, but we work with lots of folks in big formations across the South. And we are the Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy, but what we're going to talk to you about today is the Gulf South for the Green New Deal. It's important that you understand the terminology here. We say Gulf South to include the entirety of the states of Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida. And we use the term Gulf South to connote this region, but also to really take a defensive or proactive stance against this sort of lifting up of one city over another, or leaving out rural areas, or forgetting that there's also fights at capitals as well as frontline areas. So we say Gulf South because we're connoting an entire region, and that was actually a movement term formed so that we could be in less tension with one another. So just letting folks know that. And then I'll ask Emma to get us started just on Gulf South for a Green New Deal, and I'll come in on talking about some of the details. So Emma, let's get us grounded and started out here.
Thank you, Colette. Yes, y'all. Excited to be having this conversation. As Colette mentioned, GCCLP, the Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy's work, really stems out of equitable disaster recovery and has its origins in Hurricane Katrina. And we know the reality on the ground in the Gulf South. Many people who are catalyzed into the climate movement are touched by storms and climate disaster. That was our kind of starting point of organizing. We know that we don't always have the luxury of organizing it along political lines in the Gulf South, but rather we organize from a place of shared experience. And when a storm comes, it touches everyone. It won't affect everyone equally, we know that. But that is our opportunity, that is our moment. That's when people kind of realize what's happening. And so just to say, this work has been going on for 16 years since Hurricane Katrina, even much longer. And we understand Gulf South for a Green New Deal to be advancing long existing work in the region towards climate, racial, and economic justice. With that said, Gulf South for a Green New Deal did formally launch in May of 2019. I could tell y'all the longer story another night over a drink about how the Green New Deal frame kind of fell into our lap. But it's when that Green New Deal frame was getting hot, we checked in with our communities, with the people we were organizing with across the Gulf South already, and asked if people wanted in on the Green New Deal conversation. Overwhelmingly, people said, yes, we want, we see how the South and the Gulf South especially is often excluded from these national conversations. And yeah, we want to get in on this Green New Deal conversation. So May 2019, it launched Gulf South for a Green New Deal at the Mahalia Jackson Theater in Congo Square, historically a sacred site for the United Homa Nation, as well as other communities in South Louisiana. And we launched with more than 800 people, an opening by Chief August Crepel, the principal chief of the United Homa Nation, as well as other community leaders. So it was a really beautiful event that kicked off with kind of a strong base of about 30 to 35 organizations as original kind of co-partners of Gulf South for a Green New Deal. And when we're talking about Gulf South for a Green New Deal, don't get it twisted. We're not talking about just one piece of policy, because we know that even well-intentioned policy often misses the ground in the South. What we're actually talking about is a multi-year, multi-state initiative. It's a regional formation. It's a movement of organizations, networks, small businesses, communities, faith groups, neighborhood associations, fisherfolk, unions. We're working with a lot of different people across the Gulf South. And what we're working to do is connect all this really good work that's happening in these different kind of issue areas or in these different communities, and actually connect it for a unified front for regional impact. So Gulf South for Green New Deal develops policies, and it encourages engagement through regional campaigns, and we're organizing communities. We're not talking about just a piece of policy, although it certainly could include policy. We're talking about building a movement here across 5 Gulf South states strong. And we're building regional power to advance a uniquely Southern collective frontline vision for a Green New Deal. So this is us asserting for ourselves what a Green New Deal looks like in the Gulf South. And it's a sustainable future that centers laborers, farmers, fisherfolk, tribal nations, and frontline communities. That includes folks who are impacted by disaster we know in the Gulf South. We're transitioning away from extractive economies and towards sustainable economies. And I'll offer that after that May 2019 launch, we began a 6-month process. We actually used the Ocasio-Cortez Green New Deal resolution as a starting place. We printed that out. We went to our community meetings. We read it out loud for folks, and we talked about it. And we, over 6 months of meetings, of regional calls regularly, we talked about what do we agree with in this resolution, what don't we agree with, and what's missing. And it was that kind of conversation that was really rich of us, using that document as a starting place, but knowing that, like I said, even well-intentioned policy often kind of misses Southern realities because Southern communities are often excluded from national processes. It was that what's missing from this resolution conversation that I think ended up being extremely rich and really generating just a lot of content that after 6 months of collective process and then synthesis would comprise the Gulf South for a Green New Deal policy platform. So I'll put that in the chat in just a second, but this is the Gulf South for a Green New Deal policy platform is Gulf South frontline communities asserting for ourselves what a Green New Deal would need to look like to succeed in the Gulf South and therefore nationally. And with that, I think I'll turn it over to Colette to talk a little bit more about the values and the approach.
Yeah. Thanks, Emma. And as Emma puts the policy platform into the chat, I hope folks will take a look at it. We'll also make it available for folks. It's also available online. You can go to Gulf South, the number 4gnd.org to find the website where these documents are available. And I'll talk a little bit about that policy platform that we developed. Most folks, when they hear policy platform, they want to see the policy priorities. And this document does have that. But what we found using the techniques of bottom-up organizing and these Black radical traditions ingrained in folks like Fannie Lou Hamer and really used around the South, we realize and understand that movement building requires us to, at the very least, set forth and move from a set of values and principles that we can go back to, remind ourselves of, but also hold ourselves and each other accountable to. So sometimes we need to be reminded and use these as criteria. Is what we're doing advancing equity or any of these other things? But at the same time, when there's tension, we have to go back to this as an accountability tool. So while it seems like setting values and principles is really simple and probably should be done quickly, I want to encourage those of you who are going to try to engage in this kind of organizing to really take the time on values and principles. You'll find that it is the most stable part of your work. Everything else will change as circumstances and consequences change, but these hold true, and they stand as that brick to go back to. And so the 7 values of Gulf South for Green New Deal are listed here, and I'll just go through them quickly. But understand that these are synthesized words of big conversations. So we know that one main value is to advance equity. Above all, what we have to do in this work is not just bring people to a point of return, but actually address past harms while we're building solutions for the future. Equity really incorporates both the past and the future in the work that we're doing together, and we've got to advance that as we move. Following Indigenous and frontline leadership, this has been a principle of ours. We see this come up again and again every time we survey community. And following Indigenous and frontline leadership is very different from tokenizing frontline and Indigenous leadership. And this is something that folks are often not really aware of the difference of. And so it's a practice. And honoring land and acknowledging things is acceptable and certainly a first step. But there's another part of this which is going to feel a little less easy, which is listening and following folks that most of us have been educated and assimilated not to value and not to follow, to question, to exploit, to use, but not necessarily to follow. So this is actually a pretty big deal. We want to build community wealth and health. And this is based on a conversation rooted in the fact that a lot of these folks are frontline communities, they're EJ communities, and they're saying our health is our wealth. We can't just be worried about money and profit making. We've got to be worried about the health and sustainability of our bodies, of our ecosystem, of our broader ecology. And so this is really a redefinition of what community wealth is through understanding health. Invest in visionary and transformative change. There's lots of talk about transition, and we are all for it. But what we know is actually required for our community is transformation. This is only possible with a vision toward a better world. And so we need to really invest in that vision and transform our entire society, or else what we will get is the same system with a different piece of content on top of it. So we do not win if we shift everybody over to renewable energy, but we keep the extractive economic system that charges folks more than they make to have energy in their home. We've got to actually shift an entire system, and that transformation is needed. We want to advance community and local control. This necessarily takes out monopolies. This necessarily confronts major corporate holdings of public resources. This is what we are pushing for. This is what we are going for. And in order to do any of this, we've got to use this intersectional approach, this Black feminist thought process that says everything is intertwined. Think of the fabric that is intertwined. Think of the patterns that go together. This is how our society works. We are not single issue people. It can't work like that. It doesn't work like that. If you don't believe me, just look past all of these years and see what we've got. We've gotten it because we break all this stuff down into our one little silo that we like to be an expert at and get that expertise title, but it's not helpful and it's not helping to move things. But above all things, rounding off these principles are really to value all humans equally. We've watched constantly while some communities are valued over others. We've watched constantly while some people are valued over others. We get to conversations around economic justice and reparations, but also citing of toxic spaces where fights are. This is really an important piece of our work because we understand that in climate disaster, the current systems that are in place for recovery and restoration are rooted in an evaluation of human life that takes into consideration discriminatory elements that allows some people's lives to be valued more than others. So we stand against this and we want to move valuing all humans equally. Next slide. And so we've got those values, but then we had to develop a 5-point approach to really move this. And this is where we really got folks, thinking about what we're trying to do. So there's a lot of words here, but the big important words are in bold and are leading at the front. So our approach is first and foremost, not to develop the vision and move the ball down the field, but instead our first step is always to heal and to reconcile. We have to honor, archive, and advance the inherent sovereign rights and traditional knowledge of Indigenous principles and methods of healing the human relationship to land and to one another. And we want to reconcile the relationship of communities traditionally pitted against each other. We know that we want to build, connect and build. We want to connect the dots between the climate crisis, the coastal crisis, the toxic impact of extractive and polluting industries, the economic and political crisis of the Gulf South, and we have to build from there. Again, that intersectional approach. We want to shift and reimagine, shifting the frontline relationship through information sharing, community participatory research, collaborative analysis development toward an intersectional approach, and then reimagine that collective future for our region through equity and justice as a lens. And we want to build a tailored strategy in communications to shift that national narrative about value, role, and leadership, especially of the South. It's always funny how, the South gets pegged as not being able to do it like the Northeast or the West Coast, not doing it the same, perhaps, might be how other folks think about it. But we have a different reality here in the South. And we know that we have to tailor our strategy to this reality. This is why a one-size-fits-all approach to organizing, to movement will not work. We're going to have folks really bringing in the power that they bring from their regions into a broader movement. Next slide. So the last two approaches are really to democratize and organize. I really credit my colleague Emma for really bringing the democratization of information into the conversation. So, we have all these colleges down here in South Louisiana, and I'm sure you do too, where you are, where folks get to come and really learn lots of stuff, while other people in the communities around them have no access to information. And when it comes to climate change, it's this education divide and this information hoarding is now going to cost people their lives and their livelihood. There's valuable information that has not been shared, and we have to democratize that. And from there, we organize and we build alignment throughout the region. We use direct action, policy initiatives, communications campaigns. All of these things are tactics. They are not the solution. They are tactics to a broader strategy. And that's what we try to use to democratize and organize. And then finally, resource and reinvest. We are talking quite directly about what it means to receive our own resources, control them, make a collective governing decision around how to redistribute them, and then how to distribute them to the places they need to go the most. Here in the Gulf South, we've seen billions of dollars come after disaster, and time again, the communities that need it most do not get the dollars that so many of you are contributing to these large quasi-government institutions who are supposed to get the money to the front lines. But we have developed community-controlled funds and other financial instruments to allow for dollars to go directly into the hands of community, and for the decisions about where those dollars go also to be in the hands of the community. This resource and reinvest is not just about dollars. It's about the governance of those dollars, the collectivity of those dollars, and how they get back to the ground. So this is actually a really interesting space, because there's really a development of new instruments and alternative forms of community-controlled dollars coming into existence. So we can talk more about that as we go. Yeah, so I think I'll hand it over to Emma to talk a little bit about governance and decision-making, looking at some of the structures. Keep in mind, we're working across 5 Gulf South states, and so we had to develop a governance structure that could replicate across. And so I'll turn it over to Emma to talk a little bit more about that.
Thank you, Colette. Thank you for that overview. So we know that Gulf South for Green New Deal comes out of at least decades of Southern movement tradition, and really 15 years of climate work led by Colette and the Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy and many other leaders across the region since Hurricane Katrina for the last 16 years. Gulf South for Green New Deal launched in 2019 And I think the work of the last 3 years, after we got our collective vision and our values in line and started from that place of values, is really building up the governance structure. That's the work that we're currently doing. So I want to offer just a little bit of context for folks who are maybe building their own Green New Deal structures. You can learn from some of the lessons that we've been learning if they're helpful. And we're actually building up hubs in each of the 5 Gulf South states that, so this whole image here represents a hub. And in the middle, we kind of have the core, the state leads and anchors. We know that there's at least 2 anchors, one who is financial, who's able to receive and distribute dollars, one who's facilitative and really just taking a coordination role. And they're coordinating leads around policy, around actions, and around comms. And each of the leads in each of the 5 Gulf South states is then coordinating a broader table. So within each Gulf South state, there's 3 tables around policy, action, and communications. And all of that together comprises the state hub. So this is us building out our governance council. It's comprised of anchors and leads in each of the 5 states. It's established leadership that's been on the ground doing work in their own communities for a long time. And this is a way of kind of pulling those folks together, the policy people, the actions people, and the comms people, to be aligned towards statewide strategy and alignment in the state hubs. And so I want to offer, this comprises the Gulf South for Green New Deal regional governance structure, is that hub formation in each of the 5 Gulf South states. And if anyone's into biomimicry, my background is in biology and ecology. I think this looks a little bit like a water molecule. There's some hydrogen bonds going on, which we know can flow and be flexible, but it's also strong. If you've ever jumped off a rock face or a bridge, it's a little too high and hurt your butt. That water is tough and it can form a solid front, but it flows when it needs to. So this is the governance structure. And if folks have questions after or want to hear more about kind of how we set this up or the work to do that, what might be replicable in other regions, I'm definitely happy to talk more about that. And then we're getting into the external priorities and the internal work, some of the different priorities that go South for Green New Deal. Colette, do you want to take this one, or I'm happy to keep going with it?
Yeah, I'll let you do external. I'll take the internal work.
Great. So the regional synergy of the Gulf South for Green New Deal priority areas has started with 5 main areas. We've actually added 6 since. We're talking about water, labor, economy, energy, land, and just more recently we added in democracy into this mix as well. And so these are our kind of priority areas. We see each as being deeply interconnected, but it's where our policy priorities fall into these buckets. Our regional action campaigns center around these priorities, and our communications uplift narratives around each of these areas. We're using words that people understand, that our people understand. This is language cultivated from the ground and how folks understand issues. So we know, well, there's other language in the movement, there's other language in the media. These are the boxes that we're talking about, really generating from the bottom up and to meet our people where they're at. And then do you want to come in, Colette, on these kind of internal priorities state by state?
Sure. So if you take a minute to think about those state hubs, okay? Think about those 3 tables in every state, and then think about that broader hub for each state. It means we have a governance structure built in to the hub. So what we have is a policy lead, a comms lead, an action lead, and 2 anchors. We have at least 5 leaders in every state hub that's driving this broader work. So thanks for pulling this image up. So remember this state hub function, because this is who we ask about priorities. So the whole table of policy, the whole table of action, the whole table of communications, and all of the leads break out into state groups at our Gulf gathering that we have at least once a year. And that Gulf gathering is where the states come together and develop their priorities. And remember, Emma just talked to you about our priority areas: water, energy, land, labor, economy. That's what was in the spin. And it's right next to that hurricane, because you should understand, like we understand with hurricanes, that here's that biomimicry again, that these things all flow into each other, and they can, spin and create powerful impact when they're connected to one another. And so the priorities that we developed, folks came together, broke into their particular states, and then from every state looked at these priority areas and said, what do you want to do in your state as work, collective work for the next 12 months? Next slide. And so what we see in Texas is that folks want to advance tribal sovereignty. They want a statewide fracking ban. They want language access, a language access initiative to ensure state level democratic participation. And this was specifically true around many Spanish speaking communities that are being targeted for toxic facility sightings and other environmental justice concerns, but did not have the ability to really participate in their own safety and health and democratic process. In Louisiana, the priorities were cultivating public engagement around the governor's climate initiatives task force. That is created by the governor, a mandate to address carbon emissions in Louisiana by 2050. So this policy table wants to engage there, to advance good green jobs and renewable energy, to advance affordable and equitable housing. This is really where Louisiana wanted to go. Mississippi wanted to advance state level housing and climate justice policy. They wanted to intervene in the state rule around net metering. They wanted to brief the legislature on impacts of the petrochemical build out in Mississippi. This is really where the communities are setting their own priorities, even though the methods and the mechanisms are being replicated across every state. So we've got uniformity and replication, and we've got a difference in priorities. In Alabama, they wanted to launch that Green New Deal campaign in Birmingham, revoke some permits for mega prisons, really understanding that the fight around the carceral state is part of the climate fight, to stop the expansion of Alabama Power gas plant, a statewide water plan, an environmental justice plan. So these are the priorities coming out of Alabama, and surprisingly, at least to some, Alabama has some of the most advanced organizing that we've seen. Very exciting work coming out of there. Shout out to Hometown Action and to others really leading the way, GASP and some great organizations there. In Florida, there's a statewide heat stress bill that folks wanted to work on, energy reform at the state level, municipal resolutions around renewable energy. These were priorities developed at the hub level and confirmed and affirmed to move together. So these are the priorities of work for each hub. But then we also had priorities for what we needed to do as a regional anchor. So our job as a regional anchor is not to advance all of those campaigns and those pieces of work. That's the job of the participants in the hub. But as a regional anchor, our job was to continue to build out the Gulf South for Green New Deal infrastructure. We want to, of course, to help advance the state goals, but to do this, y'all know, we know, communications infrastructure is key. And we're dealing with frontline organizations. None of us have any of this stuff. And so the best thing we could do is move as a region and establish a regional communications and financial infrastructure. This allows us to get grants that pass through all of the 5 states. This allows us to make communications. When one state gets a hit, all states get a hit because they have this identifiable marker, that says Gulf South for a Green New Deal, we are moving together. And so this infrastructure is important, and we continue to build out. We're still very new, and so we're growing, but that's that website again, where you can see that website was informed by the folks participating. Shout out to Liz Maxwell, who really helped to put that together. And we had to cultivate regional leadership. The truth of the matter is we work in a very large region. Texas alone, Florida alone, massive states to try to get around. And a lot of these folks are coming into work because they're being impacted. They're not coming because they read the latest treatise on organizing, nor do they understand the 1, 2, 3 of whatever the training was. These folks actually have to develop an analysis. They know they're getting sick. They know they're being targeted, but they know they're being hit by storms and rain, but they don't really have a political analysis yet. We have to build that. That's training, that's development, that's political education series, that's folks informing each other about what they know. And that's not experts coming in to tell us something about ourselves. That's us cultivating what we know and standing in our own power and information and exchanging that amongst each other. Skill development is what we're also honing in on. And I tell you, social media, I mean, this COVID is for the birds, but the skill development around learning how to use the Zoom and making sure that everybody has what they need to participate and connect when we can't do the thing that we do so well here in the South has been a part of it. And then we want to connect and have been connecting with national and regional networks. The Southern Movement Assembly, a massive Southern formation across the 13 Southern states, really the front lines of justice. They made a call April 9 through 11 for us to move together as a Southern region. So we pulled in the Gulf South for Green New Deal Network to listen to the call of the front lines, but to make our stance on April 9th at Southern capitals across the states. So it was move with the call from the front lines, but move on the issues that we're rooted in. It was a great coming together of power. The Southeast Climate and Energy Network, we've been moving with them. We help to facilitate, the Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy helped to facilitate Southern Communities for a Green New Deal, which is just replicating this process from 5 states up to 13 Southern states. Yep, we did it again. And nope, we didn't stop. We went all the way to the national because we are also anchoring the Red, Black, and Green New Deal at the Movement for Black Lives. You guessed it, replicating what started in the Deep South and projecting that upward and outward across the nation. This is how the South sees its role in changing the way this nation works. And it's coming from the front lines and the Southern front lines, no doubt, in order to be able to build this infrastructure, but also to be able to start new processes of organizing and bringing people in. I think that's it. There's one more slide, which is just really about y'all joining us and finding more information. Again, Gulf South, the number 4gnd.org is where you can find the website. Emma's email is up here. The platform is something that we ask folks who are standing with us to sign on to. And so if you read this platform and you understand it, you're saying, and you sign on, you're saying you want to be an ally or a partner if you're not in the Gulf South. And if you're in the Gulf South, you're saying you're coming in and you want to be held accountable to at least the values of this and willing to engage around the work. I want to ask y'all to follow us on social media. Check out that hashtag Gulf South number 4GND. We'd love to get some followers onto the social media handles that are now up. And if you're in the Gulf South, we have, this is an important part of our infrastructure. We hold regional calls every month. So 5 Gulf South states come together every month to inform each other and update. The first hour of that call is a broad regional update with some national updates around Green New Deal. The second hour of that call is state breakouts. And so if any of you listening are thinking about how to work this in your region, we would really like to encourage you to think about meetings where you can do some meeting all together and then state breakouts while you've got people there. It's an easier way to use time more effectively and efficiently. There's more information. Emma, let me see, did I miss anything? And I believe we get to take questions, Nick. I'm not sure, but we're ready if that's appropriate.
Yeah, that would be great. First of all, thank you so much. So much great information there. I've got a ton of questions to dive in. And also, folks, feel free to put your questions in chat and we'll ask those in. I wanted to start at the beginning and sort of like the genesis of the idea and the relationship between the initial organizing and the kind of like congressional platform. I thought that was really interesting, and it was similar to some conversations we had out in my neck of the woods in the Pacific Northwest, where we were sort of like, there's a lot missing out of this. And, you know, cool that the conversation has started. That's great that the like kind of brand is out there or whatever, but we really want to fill in the gaps. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about those initial conversations and how, you know, people were interfacing with just like the framing of a Green New Deal and how that really like those conversations were happening.
Mm-hmm. I mean, we were the oddball out for a long time. When that play call got made, you know, our federal decision makers, even the good ones, move on their own time frame and move with their own power, and sometimes without a ground game. But for us, what we heard was the drumbeat. And so when the Green New Deal resolution got introduced, we read it and we saw lots missing, but we understood what it was. It wasn't anything other than a play call, and it was really a call for those who were ready to come in and to step up. And so what we saw were lots of folks who were not ready, who really took the time to put a lot of energy into critiquing the resolution, when the maybe it's the legal sort of approach to it, but like the non-binding resolution that doesn't say half the stuff we needed to say, just not where I'm putting my energy. Where I will put my energy is in informing folks that the drum is beating, the horns are blowing, and we're being called to step up. It is now our moment to define what this vision is going to mean for our region. And if we don't define it, someone's going to define it for us. And so that's really the attitude we took about it. We didn't take a lot of time critiquing it, except for we examined it, right? And we looked for what was missing and cultivated what we needed to lift up. Fisheries was blatantly missing, and you cannot miss fisheries living in the Gulf South. That is a can't roll with a document that doesn't talk about our like number 2 industry to number 2 to oil. You know what I mean? So, and they're an important part of our frontline community. Folks who fish. These are the tribes. These are the Vietnamese folks. These are Black oyshermen. These are folks we care about. So, we know that, and so you'll see that in the platform. I'll also mention, just because we're talking about the genesis of this. The genesis of our work is really in Gulf South Rising, which was in 2015. And it's why we were able to hear the drumbeat. It was because we were already getting into formation and building on a regional initiative around climate years before. We didn't care what you called it, Green New Deal, purple and green hat, whatever you want to call this. What we understood, as you were saying, you wanted to address the climate crisis and you wanted to center equity and justice. And we're all in. Whatever you want to call that, we'll be in. Now, we are facing, we're in the red zone here, moving with a formation that has Green New Deal in the name, and the Republicans, the conservatives, the other side is definitely, hitting it. But we've got a different reality on our side. Half of the people in Louisiana have been through some sort of disaster in the last 5 years that has taken some sort of toll on their life and livelihood. We don't have to spend a lot of time convincing folks that what we're saying is true. What we end up having to do is to really go against that narrative, and to offer folks the ability to call it whatever you want to call it. whatever you need to say to walk in this door to stand with us is fine with us. And so I just want to mention that we understood that kind of flexibility since Katrina, because in Katrina, we weren't organizing one type of worker or one group of people. That's never been our approach. We've always had a multiracial, multi-sectoral approach with all kinds of politics involved. And so we've had to be flexible to allow folks to really find themselves in this work and then come in as their full selves.
Do you find, are you getting pushback in the kind of like policy realm or from Republicans or anybody else around that framing? Does it inhibit recruiting at all, or is your organizing strategy kind of like circumventing those brand difficulties?
Yeah, my biggest disappointment is in the progressive left. Like the inability to fight or have any kind of courage to stand your ground is like, it just, I'm trying not to show you all of my disgust all over my face, but it's just like, at some point we have to fight. At some point you've got to hold the line. You don't keep switching because people are uncomfortable. You get nowhere like that. You've got to have some kind of principle. We're standing on Green New Deal because we want a Green New Deal. We've defined it for ourselves and this is what it is. We're not stepping away from it. And we're watching, mostly in the policy realm, the left try to move away from it because it's, we watched this with I mean, don't get me started on defund and all this other stuff. Like, I need the folks who are saying they stand on the side of the front lines and on the side of the people to step up and show some courage and hold the line. Yes, we're getting pushback. We were going to get pushback if we called it Cinderella. We were going to get, what do you think these oil companies are going to say? Yes, we're all excited about this. That is not how this is going to go. This is a struggle we are in, but it does not have to be a bloodbath, and we certainly don't have to eat each other. So, I mean, you know, I wish we would raise not only these intellectual leaders in this movement, but also some warriors who understand that every now and again, you're going to have to do something hard and inconvenient and a little bit uncomfortable. And that's the way this goes. We're fighting for the planet. This is not going to be easy.
Yeah, oil industry is going to roll over for us.
I mean, look at where we are. What you think they're going to do? Throw a party? Nobody's excited about us taking this on, my friend.
It's found the screaming. I guess we'll just have to let you win now. Yes. Yeah, it's so interesting. You know, I'm also just like really curious. I know that you talked about some of the prior organizing, but the complexity of just like moving to 5 states is also just like an enormous accomplishment in and of itself, to be able to like coordinate people on that level, and then thinking about like scaling up to like 13. Like, can you talk a little bit more? And you had mentioned some of the like alternative financing stuff that's starting to come around. Like, what are the organizing structures that you're seeing just emerging out of this like audacious play to do like a regional effort?
Yeah, let me punt that to my regional lead here and see what she's seeing bubble up. Emma, you've got any thoughts about this?
Got a lot of thoughts about it. I appreciate the question, Nick. Yeah, I mean, that's a big part of our work, I think, is the balance too between being involved and really supporting work that's happening in each state hub, but really coordinating and building out the structures that are needed to actually align that work happening across 5 states. And to the point kind of about, I think one of those structures that we're really excited about playing out regionally with this kind of conversation we're having around participatory budgeting and alternative finance is around the need for structures that really allow people to, and through Gulf South Green New Deal as a vehicle, to receive and distribute dollars in an authentically democratic way and in a way that actually builds power. We know that oftentimes when money hits the ground and it's coming to folks who've been forced into perceived scarcity, actual scarcity, you know, forced to always compete for money, and that money comes with its own tension and its own conflict. And it was actually thought leadership that happened. Colette mentioned Gulf South Rising as a 2015 climate justice movement that laid a lot of the groundwork for Gulf South for Green New Deal. In 2015 and 2016, through Gulf South Rising, we created what was called the Gulf South Rising Community Controlled Fund. And this was really a mechanism of community controlled finance. You know, a group of people sitting in a circle at meetings in South Louisiana for a year, really just asking this question: how can we receive and distribute dollars in a way that's actually accountable to our community? And the conversation was beautiful. It was tedious. It got into quorum and into decision-making mechanisms and into really the nitty-gritty of what that looks like. But it laid a lot of groundwork that we're actually returning to now 5 years later in a way that I think is really beautiful to kind of model an authentically democratic mechanism for distributing money in the state hub, for letting folks to make collective decisions on their own, to really practice receiving and distributing money. Colette mentioned, you know, we see again and again in the face of these disasters, there's billions of dollars that through FEMA or through philanthropy that come, but they never reach the ground. And we know that this is a piece of movement infrastructure that is necessary, materially useful. And we also know that it's about more than just the money, and all of the work that we're doing to really build this structure and to coordinate folks across 5 states is really around building self-governance. And so I think the work that we do in one state, we always strive to be strong enough to be replicable in another state, but malleable enough to be adjusted, knowing that every state has its own unique reality.
And do you feel momentum from campaigns moving across your structures pretty readily now? Like, so for example, I mean, the stuff that you described in Alabama, I think is so interesting and inspiring to really start connecting like the violence economy toward the need to transition and like incarceration, all the rest. Do you see that kind of energy then like kind of move into the other spaces that you're organizing, or did the states kind of stay pretty siloed in terms of what they're focused on?
Yeah, I'll just take this one. We see over and over again these leaders and these states influence each other with information and strategy and tactics. And it's been amazing to watch what happens when folks um, start to understand not just what's happening in their community, but that the South is part of a strategy of sacrifice to industry for this nation. And it's not something you can tell people in that and they understand. You almost have to come to the realization of it, right? Like, oh, they're doing that in Mississippi, they're doing that in Louisiana, they're doing that in Alabama. It's the same company. They didn't get the permit in Florida, they got moved to Alabama. Like, that's the way this stuff is going, you know, and they start talking to each other. It's kind of amazing. We're still very new. So this is our first full year. You know, I mean, COVID really took a little wind out of our sails as we were really kind of building up to do the thing that we do best, which is get people together to connect on a higher level, not just the sort of intellectual level, but this human level of moving together. So we're seeing inspiration across the states and across the different leaderships. We're watching ideas come from one state and really pop into another or pop into two or three. Just this morning, we were talking about a legislative tracker that's in Louisiana and making sure that that is replicated now across 5 states so that people can track legislation. I mean, I'm sure this sounds very elementary to some folks, but in the Deep South, a lot of the infrastructure that helps to build movement and challenge these systems, it just isn't there. So we're building things from scratch. We're seeing cross-pollination, we're seeing inspiration, but it's coming in little dewdrops. So we're waiting for it to turn into a hurricane sometime soon.
In my understanding, especially in Louisiana, there's also, you know, it's hard to get organized when you're being moved around by hurricanes all the time or floods, or, you know, my understanding of the petrochemical industry's expansion in Louisiana specifically is that it's, you know, just like Jindal, like handing the state away to like companies and sort of like have these little sovereign territories of petrochemical refining and all the rest. Would you mind just talking about the specific context in Louisiana? You'd mentioned this phrase, the part of a strategy of sacrifice. Could you put a little bit of a finer point on that in the places that you live?
Yeah, it is important to talk about Louisiana, but it's important to understand Louisiana in part of a broader Southern sacrifice zone. And the South has been a sacrifice zone for this nation since its founding. And it's an important piece of analysis. You know, folks didn't just come to the violence economy, to the care economy. That's part of our Climate Justice 101 training. You've got to understand these extractive economies in all of their forms. You've got to understand fossil fuel extraction and the extraction of Black people from a continent to be free labor, to build wealth that they have no access to. And so there's a broader analysis here. It's way bigger than the climate movement's analysis, which is inadequate for transformation, right? The climate movement right now at best gets us to transition, at best. And I'm not even sure it gets us there. I think it just gets us to reform at some level that, you know, that some people can survive. But we need something much bigger than that. And so Louisiana is, it's also, I think, a replication of what we're seeing in the global South. You know, we cannot forget that what we're seeing in Louisiana, we're seeing in Nigeria, we're seeing in Brazil, we're seeing in Indonesia. These are the same fights and the same companies. And so in Louisiana, we have, you know, all of the oil and gas infrastructure and one of the largest rivers in the world with deep ports. This makes us opportune for not just oil and gas drilling and fracking, but it makes it a place where pipelines want to come to so that they can be exported at the port and go off to bring heating and other kinds of fuel to Europe and to other places. So we are not just fighting the emissions fight, we're fighting the petrochemical infrastructure, the pipelines, the trains, the highway systems that bring dangerous things into communities and idle at ports for hours. This is the region. And the Port of Houston, the Port of New Orleans, these are massive, massive ports within just a little bit of distance from each other. So in addition to oil and gas at its sort of very beginning phases, we're getting the refineries and these plastics companies, these toxic industries that use the residue of what oil and gas produces and turns it into more toxic things for our planet to die from and your pocket to spend on. And so you're fighting methane plants, you're fighting plastic plants. When you say Bobby Jindal let folks in, he let in a company from South Africa that is only allowed to work in 3 countries in the world because it's so bad. And they moved out a Black community called Mossville by pretty much poisoning them. So, I mean, this is a Louisiana is a small state in a large nation, but it plays a large role in a global problem. And if we make progress in Louisiana and in the Gulf South, we absolutely shift this nation, but we also replicate solutions for the global South, for the world. This is where the solutions have to come from if we want to win.
Hear, hear. I'm going to turn, there's a couple of questions in the audience I want to bring in. So Shri asks if you could all elaborate on how Gulf South, the Green New Deal supports vulnerable communities like people of color, people with disabilities, et cetera, facing natural disasters, and how that can be applied in a broader national context in the face of other natural disasters, like in the Pacific Northwest wildfires, for example.
Thanks, Shri. I think the best answer to your question is not actually Gulf South for a Green New Deal, but the Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy. So our organization, the Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy, we offer legal services in the aftermath of disaster through pop-up legal clinics that we also use to politicize folks into the climate world. So free legal services to help with all the paperwork and all of the ridiculousness that comes with disaster recovery, but with political education and partnership with community groups to help people understand exactly what they just got hit by. So this is about getting your house back, but it's also about understanding that what's about to keep coming to you is, more things that are going to impact your house and your home and your livelihood. How do we include the Gulf South for Green New Deal formation. So we do our sort of service work at the Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy. The formation is itself its own thing. And so how people are included and called in is really a function of the whole, as opposed to a function of like one organization. So, inclusion, these things are part of our values. We have to examine and reevaluate these things all the time. We've been doing a lot online. So, I take your point. I also have to just say we've been in a little bit of a suspended state for a while, just to sort of, I think, advance inclusion in the most obvious ways. But I think we're taking an understanding of trauma-informed analysis development, of inclusion, of equality around valuing all people, really bringing that to really seed the analyses that are being developed. And really taking our lead from the front lines, the Black folks, the Native folks, the disabled folks, the poor folks. They get the most time on the microphone. That's who the space is for. They're stepping up as our leads. This is that following that leadership. I'm sure we can always get better on all things, but what I'm seeing is people using their life experiences to inform the analysis that are coming out of this region. And the life experiences of most people here is not academic. It's one of understanding marginalization from different perspectives and making sure that we are not creating systems that replicate that kind of marginalization.
Great. Question from Danny. with a little bit of like the change in the national politics here and maybe some opportunities for infrastructure bills or climate legislation to move in the near future, Daniel wants to know, how does the coalition plan to hold to principles while engaging with the kind of like DC center of what they consider to be realistic at any given time?
Well, we don't, I was gonna be like, we're not even messing with DC, but that's not true. That's just me having an attitude. But what I will say is the targeted areas for Gulf South for a Green New Deal is actually local. It's state and municipal. It's engaging at the state level and at the regulatory level, because what most people aren't really paying attention to, especially with the new administration, is that even if all progressive climate people win everything they ever wanted to do in policy, the way it works down here in the South is no matter the policy, things don't get enforced and you're dealing with a different kind of system. The blockage is at the state level for us, not at the federal level. I know that everyone was shocked about the last administration, but that's our everyday life. Sorry to say, like we live that all the time, every day, all my life, which what the nation had to experience for 4 short years has been a long 40 for some of us. And so I'll just say that the focus on the state, unclogging things that we need to flow so that when federal legislation does pass, there's no obstacle, or there are fewer obstacles at the state level, engaging in at the regulatory and agency level, because what's happening in Louisiana oftentimes is a lack of enforcement, or a need for a study or some sort of federal, some sort of formal acknowledgement so that things can happen. So most of our work is not engaging at the DC level, but engaging at the state and local level. I will say, to hold to our principle, we just held a, on BP 11, which was April 20th, we celebrated, commemorated, remembered the lives of the men lost in the Deepwater Horizon explosion on 11 years ago. But we held a forum with the federal administration, one of the agencies. And what was really great is that nobody softened their language with these agency leaders who were there for the duration of a community forum around the impacts of the petrochemical industry in the Gulf, with people calling time and time again for not just a suspension of leasing in federal waters off the Gulf, in the Gulf of Mexico, but a complete cessation of the program. Again and again, people were like, we cannot have any more drilling. It was, one of the survivors of Deepwater Horizon calling for a cessation of this. So this was the tone and the values that have been articulated were not just a list that we cultivated in like a 30-minute phone call. These were things that had to be cultivated over time, and everyone is bought in on the principles. And so to hold to that is the easiest thing we can do. I think the proof is going to be in the details of, what folks are able to advance at the state level, at the municipal level. We're going to have to make sure we're not sacrificing people. We have to make sure that people are being valued equally. But this comes, with every piece of work we have to do, we have to examine the principles. And we've got a pretty solid team. They're holding strong on the principles at the very least.
Excellent. Is a kind of more specific question about a comment that Emma had made earlier about democratizing information. Question is, can you share more about what kinds of information are being democratized and what kind of monopolies you're working to take down and how?
I'm happy to talk a little bit about the democratizing information, and I can say some about the monopolies. Colette, but I'll let you come in there too if you have anything to add. So we're working to democratize all types of information. And I think a lesson for sure that you learn in this region, and I'm sure in many regions, is not to take for granted the skills that I think folks who get to be paid organizers at nonprofit organizations maybe get to take for granted. And COVID has really been I mean, a reminder, a time to really know that we're not working in the region where everyone has good broadband access or computers or tech literacy. You know, folks have a lot of other skills and a lot of other knowledge and know how to survive on the land and navigate the bayous and catch your dinner for, you know, at the water, but logging onto Zoom and using the Google Docs and just reading all the emails that come is not the skill set that's, you know, has been valued here, I think for good reason. And so when it comes to democratizing information, especially this year, it's been a lot of tech trainings, a lot of, you know, kind of democratizing just information about how to navigate this kind of conversation and how to navigate online. I'm also thinking about, for example, one of the Louisiana priorities that Colette mentioned was engaging with the governor's climate task force. This is a statewide formation called by the Louisiana governor. And in that process, we're doing work to really kind of cultivate the lessons learned and see what parts of this process will be replicable, you know, knowing that there might be statewide governor's task force in other states coming up. And so I think it's that kind of process of when there's a certain bill, when there's a certain governor's task force, there's a process happening in one state. We are engaging with that in a meaningful way. And we're also seeking and asking kind of what can be replicated, what can be shared across the region. So that a lesson learned in Louisiana, you know, saves folks time, builds out infrastructure, builds toolkits, you know, and kind of shares content that can help inform that same kind of parallel campaign in Mississippi, Alabama, or any other state. It's the same with the Community Controlled Fund. That was really a year of deep work and thinking and coming together. And the toolkit and the curriculum that we're building out now is really about sharing that information across 5 states, not because that work needs to be replicated verbatim from state to state, but because it can save folks a lot of work. So that's just something we're kind of always thinking about with Gulf South for Green New Deal, is with it kind of any state hub, any piece of work that's moving, how can we share it across 5 Gulf South states? So continuously building up our shared analysis. Yeah, plenty of examples of that. Happy to talk more.
Yeah, and I just on the monopolies question, I mean, the investor-owned utilities are a main player in folks really understanding this broader energy system that starts with fossil fuels, but ends with a very high energy burden on these majority Black cities across the South, not just the Gulf South, across the South. And if you look at energy burden and you start to understand the energy burden in the on poor people, on Black people, on frontline folks in the South, and then you understand the energy use of industry in places like Louisiana that is hard to decarbonize and hard to make into renewable, you get to a different kind of conversation, which is the transition is going to have to be, you know, big and transformative, and it's going to have to take into account not just where we're taking energy from the land, where we're extracting fossil fuels, but also what these grids are doing, what these investor-owned utilities are doing, and what it means in the South, where you have the largest numbers of households living below the poverty line. So this is a reality that is unique to the South, but it is a legacy of slavery that we're dealing with. And so the monopolies that we're dealing with are, interestingly enough, on the same lands of the plantations that started the extractive economic process in the first place. Where you had plantations, you now have refineries or prisons, and they're all adjacent to that river, and they're causing cancer down a river corridor, and they're addressing our fresh water supply. And so the other monopolies are these big oil companies. Have you seen them? They are large, and they are multinational corporations headquartered in Louisiana and Texas. So this is, we have some work to do, but these are the monopolies we're talking about, and it's not a demonization. That's not helpful now. We're too late for that. We're too late to make them feel bad about themselves. We've got to actually build solutions here, and we've got to build solutions that don't just shift us from one energy system to another, but shift us to a renewable energy system that is controlled by the community. So that's a that's a number of changes that have to happen, not just oil to solar, which I think has been oversimplified by the climate movement. We need much more than that. So yeah, so that's just a little bit of the of that. And I want to apologize. I told Caleb I needed to run. We've got a long day and an early morning, but I'll, if you don't mind, I'll leave Emma here. She loves staying up late, by the way. You should just ask her questions all night long. But I just want to say thank you for the opportunity to be here. And Nick, I'll talk with you about how to follow up, and Emma will hold tight with y'all as we wrap up.
Yeah, thank you so much, Colette. And
thank you, friend.
Opportunity to see your speech at Power Shift last week too, and just best of luck to the best to y'all, and however we can be supportive and helpful, let us know.
Thank you so much, brother. Appreciate that. Peace.
Cheers. Okay, Emma, a couple more questions.
Sure.
And feel free also, if I know the time difference, if it gets to be late, feel free to ease out. One thing that has changed a lot in like my milieu in the Pacific Northwest is around information is the areas that were more accessible to us, like local and state government, have become far less accessible, and kind of like strangely federal government has become more accessible. And I don't know if you've seen something similar in your area.
Interesting. And you're talking about with COVID, or just kind of in a broad way?
Yeah. So basically, like I've done, almost exclusively local and state organizing, just because I'm just like, I don't mess with the feds because they don't do anything ever. And so what's the point? And we've had a lot of success in our movements regionally here on fossil fuel fights, especially just mobilizing local governments. And then suddenly, like, there's just like a Zoom block and you can't get access anymore. But like all of these like federal officials that we never had any access to before, I think it maybe because it's harder to do backroom lobbying stuff or something. Sure. And it's tracked more, and so there's like a record, and so they actually like it helps.
That's funny.
But I wonder if you've seen, maybe not the same, but what are the kind of like changes in advocacy that have happened since COVID?
Sure. Yeah, I appreciate that question. It's interesting. I mean, I think for one, the win in Georgia this year is just something I find myself coming back to. And I just, with great respect to the Black women in Georgia who really did the organizing on the ground to swing Georgia blue. And I just cannot overstate how possible I think that is in almost every Southern state, certainly in every Gulf South state. But Louisiana, for example, is purple. We have a blue governor right now. That's how that Governor Climate Task Force came about. And so I do think this was an interesting year for maybe breaking through that kind of wall, I think, of the total divestment in any kind of federal electoral work. The South, it's interesting actually organizing this region in particular, because Texas and Florida both receive a lot of investment and considered purple states, whereas Mississippi, Louisiana, and Alabama do not. And I think this could be a year where maybe that narrative is being challenged in a more fundamental way. And I think people are seeing the value in understanding that the South is the blackest part of the country, the poorest part of the country, severely gerrymandered and voter suppressed. And if we actually just invested in voter accessibility here, it would change the whole entire country, and treating every Southern state like it's a swing state, not just Georgia. So I do think this was an interesting year in kind of the federal narrative. With that said, I think to Colette's point, we don't focus on federal organizing. I mean, we've submitted the Gulf South for a Green New Deal policy platform to several congressional bodies and have been in touch with several senators around it. But it's more just our point of access, I think, still is local decision makers, and not because we're getting through to all of them, certainly. I mean, industry and the kind of circuit from industry to government here is certainly a revolving door. But I think our focus is local politics because, that still is where we're most able to engage. And it's also just what we need to kind of win. This has been an exciting couple of years too, I would say, for our folks running for office. And we seen a couple of really exciting campaigns. One leader, Margaret Green, really involved in Gulf South for Green New Deal Louisiana, a farmer from South Louisiana who ran for state ag commissioner, her first time running on like a very progressive climate justice platform, and I think lost by less than 200,000 votes. And yeah, I'm excited to kind of see how the Gulf South for Green New Deal frame can also really invite and allow folks to get into local office. So still kind of prioritizing, I would say, state level engagement. COVID's certainly not making things more accessible, but our work is largely around power building still at this phase anyway.
Nice. A question from the chat here from Jay. Says, not sure if it's been addressed, but does Gulf South for the Green New Deal do any direct legislative drafting?
Totally. So like Colette said, this is the first full year that we've been operational, but that is the direction that every policy table has indicated that they're going. And so we're seeing some of that happening in Alabama with that water bill, especially the statewide water bill. But those are also kind of skills that certainly exist within the network. This is another great example, I think, of information we're trying to democratize and kind of skills we're trying to share. And part of Gulf South for Green New Deal really being investing in leadership development and trainings. That kind of legislative drafting skill set is one that's being built up in the movement. So we're seeing that in its early stages now in Alabama for sure. Some of the recommendations going into the Louisiana Governor's Climate Task Force, really, especially around carbon sequestration and storage, is a hot thing in Louisiana right now, being pushed by industry through that task force, and some of the recommendations being drafted by the Equity Committee, which we help chair, being kind of spun off into direct policy and legislative recommendations. So that's the direction we're going for sure. If you take a look at the policy platform, you'll see it exists in very broad strokes. It's very values rooted. And then it's the work of the actual state hubs and the policy tables to kind of start that direct legislative drafting.
Awesome. Yeah, Jay's our board president. He's coordinating on the East Coast with some coalitions, and I think that they're probably taking a lot of inspiration from some of the organizing you all have done as well. And I guess as we kind of wrap up here, one question I'm pretty interested in, might touch on a little bit, but what's your advice to folks who are starting at like a smaller scale and maybe regions that are not as paid attention to, but have their own set of local problems, and they're just getting started on doing kind of like Green New Deal type of organizing? What should they be looking for?
Love that. I think something that was really important for us was that we were defining what a Green New Deal is for ourselves. And I think, to me, most fundamentally, like the Green New Deal frame, like we're in it, obviously, we're holding that line, and yes, that's the work. And also, like I was part of Gulf South Rising in 2015. There were other justice initiatives before this. I think there'll be other justice initiatives after this. And to me, the game is movement infrastructure, and power building and self-determination. And so I think don't lose the forest for the trees. I think get really clear on what it is you're trying to advance. Climate change is gonna create a lot of really hard situations. It already has, and a lot of communities are forced with hard situations every day. But what we need to survive in the Gulf South is self-determination, is people to be able to come together, to share information, to know each other, to know who to call, and to actually stand in their own power and make decisions for themselves. And so I think that process of defining what a Green New Deal looks like for us and what it would need to look like to succeed here is kind of most fundamentally the work. And I think it could be called a million different things, and that's still the kind of cycle of the work that we're doing, is building self-determination and self-governance. So I think get clear on what it is, the work that you want to do, make it inclusive from the beginning, pull in all the people that you want at the table with an idea, and be humble enough to kind of receive feedback and changes to that idea, as opposed to kind of building out a thing and then asking folks to join. And I think that kind of collective process and relationship building is slow, but something we know in South Louisiana is that a lot of times when you cook things slowly, they're more delicious in the end. So I'd say take your time, give yourself your space, pull in your people, and take the first step.
Awesome. Do you have any kind of like last thoughts as we wrap up here? Any tidbits that you want to share, or anything that maybe wasn't captured earlier?
One thing that was just kind of on top for me, hearing about I thought the monopoly question was an interesting one. And I'll just offer that if we take on the biggest industry in the world, there's certainly going to be lashback. And I think there's a real opportunity to learn from organizers in the global South, who've been dealing with kind of state-sanctioned violence from industry and really like organized in tactical ways before. I think we see that in this region as well, certainly not to the same extent, but I think we need to be ready for consequences and not unaware of what it means to actually be ready to win and really challenge these industries. And I think that's also kind of a strength of Gulf South for Green New Deal, in addition to really, proactively countering these kind of divide and conquer fault lines that have separated our region historically. There's also safety in numbers. And we know that in some communities in the rural South, it's not safe to call for a Green New Deal on your own, but when you're one of 30 or 40 cities that's in a coordinated fashion, calling for a shared vision, it just becomes a very different type of thing. And so I think that kind of power building, that kind of protecting our people and really just being real with the political reality is an important part of this work as well. And I think investment in the Gulf South will just change the whole country and the world. And I think wins here. I'm just really proud and excited to see what's happening in this region, to see leadership kind of finally being recognized and standing up and coming together. Gulf South for Green New Deal was one of the first regional initiatives for a Green New Deal. And it's just been really inspiring and exciting for me. I'm grateful that I get to work on this every day. So glad for the opportunity to be here too and talk about it with y'all. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Yeah, thank you so much for talking with us. Thank you so much for the work. It's very, very inspiring. I've been digesting a lot of it over the last few years, and it's always giving me a little bit of an area to pursue that I hadn't previously considered. So it's very creative, and it's your influence is being felt far and wide. So whether you see it, it's definitely happening. Well, thank you so much. We'll wrap this up now for folks who are following live and for folks who are going to watch later on YouTube. Next week, we have like a different schedule. We're going to have some folks from the UK talking about a feminist Green New Deal. And one of our most active participants involved, Volunteer Sri, is going to host that. So it'll be at actually noon Pacific time next week. And so I'll send out an email update to remind folks about that. But yeah, I'm going to hit the stop record button and we'll end for the day. Thanks again, Emma. And
yeah, thank you, Nick. Thank you so much for the invitation, and thanks y'all for the folks who are still with us.